Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Adil Shuaib Diaries. Today we are going to be answering the question: is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu still effective in MMA? Okay guys, so to address this question, we first have to look at three particular points, and I'm going to try and go through each point to the best of my ability here. So let's get right into it. Point number one, we need to kind of visit why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was I want to use the term invented, but what sort of inspired it, right? Kind of dates back to why a lot of martial arts were developed in the very beginning, and that was basically the concept of self-defense. Yes, I'm gonna say it. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was inspired by the concept of a smaller, weaker person defending themselves against a larger, stronger opponent. Now, I want to be clear on this point. I'm not saying that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is just solely for smaller, weaker people. Nor am I saying it invented for smaller people. What I'm saying is that was what kind of inspired some of the techniques and the concept and the philosophy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because if we go into history, we will learn that Helio Gracie, he himself, was of a small stature or small build. So point number one, let's look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu through the lens of self-defense. And a lot of the concepts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was essentially about distance management, establishing control, and being able to find yourself in a dominant position by getting out of obviously a very I want to say a very dangerous position. Now that was point number one. If we look into the history of martial arts in general, if we look at karate, for example, there was some sort of influence or mindset or philosophy that's based around self-defense, around this concept of a smaller, weaker person defending themselves against a larger opponent. Obviously, as the art form develops and as more and more people practice the art, there are different influences, the new concepts and styles are introduced, and the art form itself will change. Now, which brings me to point number two: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu making it into the mainstream. When I say mainstream, I'm talking about the mainstream media, sport channels, and I'm talking about general community and people actually knowing what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is. Now, if we go back and look at sort of the 80s, we saw this trend where karate was the go-to martial arts, and kind of like the 70s with the whole Bruce Lee era, there was a lot of hype around kung fu. And now of course since the early to mid 90s, there's been an increase in interest in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's because of Jiu-Jitsu was effectively introduced into the mainstream media, and a lot of martial arts schools also adopted some of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. Now this is due to one thing we called the UFC. So this brings me to point number two. The Ultimate Fighting Championship in the early days was basically a no-holds-barred contest to determine which martial arts style was better than the other, or more dominant or effective. Now, as some of you may or may not know, Royce Gracie essentially represented the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the early days of the UFC, where he effectively defeated larger opponents. And this essentially launched Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into the mainstream, because a lot of people who saw this saw someone who was smaller and weaker defeating someone who was much larger. So point number two, the UFC, the early days of the UFC had a lot to do with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's popularity and growth. How is this relevant to the question, is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu still effective in MMA? This brings me to point number three: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a sport. So we've established that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started off as a martial art and a form of self-defense. We established that the UFC was used as a platform to prove the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, point number three, we address Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu becoming a sport. Now, when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became a sport, like any other sport, there were rules introduced, because you can't play a game without having rules. There are no rules, the game isn't fair. And that's essentially what people refer to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu nowadays. They refer to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as playing the game, and they refer to those who practice the art as Jiu-Jitsu players. And when we put two athletes or two martial artists of the same style fighting each other, this art form sort of develops into something else, where you learn to defend against someone who has training in a similar art form, and you learn these tricks and you learn these different techniques that are effective against defending against someone else who has the same or similar skill set that you have. And we've seen this in karate. We've seen this happen in karate. When karate went into the mainstream and karate became a sport, a lot of the defensive techniques apply to, or offensive techniques for that matter, apply to a karateka up against another karateka. And that's when the essence of the martial art becomes watered down and the original message becomes very diluted. Point number 3, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coming into its own as a sport, rules being introduced, and people adopting a more sport competitive mindset that sort of changed the approach in the way that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is being trained. Now, the question is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu still effective in mixed martial arts? And really, there's no easy way to answer that. But what I would say is, right now there's a split in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community. There are those who consider themselves very traditional and for the self-defense philosophy which was introduced initially by the likes of Helio Gracie. Then there are those who want to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to prove its effectiveness or test themselves and their skill set as a grappler in a mixed martial arts setting. And for that matter, there are perhaps other martial artists, maybe boxers and kickboxers and karate fighters and Shaolin fighters who want to test their techniques in a full contact fight situation. And then I'd say the third group of people who are the high level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes taking home the gold medals and winning championship after championship. And really, in order for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to be effective in mixed martial arts, it comes down to the method and approach of the way it is trained. Now, my personal opinion, and again, this is just my personal opinion, but modern day point Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a point system isn't very effective. Just like any other martial art, as a point system isn't very effective in a full contact fight in a mixed martial arts setting. So if you are a IBJJF point fighter, you are likely going to struggle in the cage. Those who take a more traditional approach, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a self-defense martial art, perhaps, and I say perhaps, there will be a bit more effectiveness in that regard. As we see the sport of mixed martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to grow and more people take on these sports, we also have to realize that there are rule sets that may or may not apply to what the actual art form was intended. Something else I want to address is mixed martial arts rules are very specific in that they are only 5-minute rounds, whereas traditional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and especially if you look at the early UFC days, there was no time limit. So the idea of settling in a position and fighting it out until you get a dominant position or a submission, that's also one of the contributing factors to sort of prove the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You could be in a fight, and no matter how long it takes, eventually you will get to that point where you are able to submit your opponent. However, when you have a 5-minute round, a minute of which you are probably striking, a minute of which you are clinching, and then perhaps 3 minutes on the ground defending strikes, it's a completely different ball game. In a nutshell, in my personal opinion, if you want your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training to be effective in mixed martial arts, you have to train specifically for the sport of mixed martial arts and adjust your skill, your tool set. So your bag of tools in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu needs to apply. Example, De La Riva guard, probably not going to work. but a good solid side control, as basic and simple as it may sound, will likely still be effective. So focus on the task at hand, adjust your training approach, and your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skill set can and still may be effective in a mixed martial arts setting. That's all for me today on this topic. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for more. If you did like the video, please give it a like and subscribe for future videos on a similar topic. So that is me wrapping up. Take care and goodbye.